So in this video, we're going to talk about Chu T'ien Hsin's short story, Man of La Mancha. So Chu is a contemporary Taiwanese writer, and part of the reason that that is particularly important is because this story is really centered on a first-person narrator thinking about their own mortality, but more specifically than that, thinking about how they will be remembered after death. And that's significant because this is an important component of Chinese culture, of many East Asian cultures, but Chinese culture is the relevant one for Chu, because again, she's Taiwanese. So the first line of the story, the first whole paragraph, the single sentence first paragraph, strictly speaking, that was the day I began thinking about making preparations for my own death. Again, the Chinese culture has a long tradition of venerating one's ancestors, and so because ancestors are incredibly important, there's a high degree of reverence for the dead. And because there is a high degree of reverence for the dead, that kind of necessitates that those who are living think about how they will be remembered after their own deaths. Will they be remembered positively? Will they be remembered at all? And a lot of this story focuses on this anxiety that the narrator feels about being forgotten or dying in a public place and having his body be unidentifiable because he drinks too much coffee, doesn't sleep enough, and so he has this sort of seizure where he passes out and on a public street, and this group of he's in the sorry, no, let me get this absolutely correct. He feels like he's going to pass out. He starts sort of losing control of his limbs. He manages to make his way to a medical facility where they hook him up to an IV, and they're basically like, yeah, you need to sleep more and drink less coffee. And so he has this sort of fantasy of himself dying on a street, and the people, and how these people would react, these random passerby. Like, some people would draw back in fear, some people would potentially rush to his aid. Eventually, one person would, with the supervision of others to sort of establish that they are not stealing things, would eventually go through the narrator's pockets trying to find ID, but nothing in this narrator's wallet has his actual identity, which we never find out in the story, right? We never get a name for this character. So there is a sort of interesting craft mirroring content element there, where in this story where the narrator is primarily concerned about being identifiable and being rememberable, he's never identified. We don't have a name with which to label this character. And I'll come back to why that's interesting. So the narrator is thinking about this, and he realizes that there is a practical solution, an immediate way to solve that problem. What he says here is, could all this really result from an absence of identifiable items? From that very moment on, I began to think about making preparations for my own death. Or should I say, it occurred to me that I ought to prepare for unpredictable, unpreventable circumstances surrounding my death. Maybe you'll say nothing could be easier. All I had to do was start carrying a picture ID or a business card, like someone with a heart condition who's never without a note that says, Whoever finds this, please send the bearer to a certain hospital, phone the following family members, in the order their numbers appear here, and most important, take a glycerin pill out of the little bottle in my pocket and place it under my tongue. But no, that's not what I meant. Maybe I should say that it was the genesis of my worries, but as my thoughts unfolded, they went far beyond that. So, this character is well aware that there is a simple, straightforward, and immediately practicable solution to the problem of a concern about being identifiable after one's death. And that is not really the concern that the narrator has. What he's actually concerned about is trying to curate the impression of his life after death. So what he says here in terms of this is, and that's why I envy chronically ill patients and old folks nearing the end of their lives, like Brunel. There's a story told earlier about the author. I can't remember his first name off the top of my head. Brunel. Luis Brunel, Spanish director. Sorry, not author. I was thinking of someone else. Like Brunel, for they have adequate time to make their preparations since death is anticipated. I don't mean just writing a will or making their own funeral arrangements, stuff like that. What I'm saying is they have enough time to decide what to burn and destroy and what to leave behind. The diaries, correspondence, photographs, and curious objects from idiosyncratic collecting habits they've treasured and kept throughout their lives. So this comes with a lot of different stories. One in which the narrator attended the funeral of a friend who was very conservative, very traditional, very sort of morally upright, whatever it is. But he had died in somewhat strange circumstances in a brothel, basically. And so while that was never addressed at the funeral or the memorial service or anything like that, it was this weird thing that raised questions for people about this person, about his life, about who he really was, etc., etc. The circumstances of his death changed the way that people looked at him. So that's part of the anxiety that this narrator has about death and how people will perceive it. And so he starts micromanaging his daily routine, thinking about where he's walking in case he dies on a sidewalk in front of a disreputable alley or something like this. He doesn't necessarily want people to be like, why was he at that disreputable alley? All these things. He also talks about things that should be kept or not. Like he tells this story where he had to go through the belongings, the office belongings of a colleague who died, and he finds basically a sex diary that this guy kept of sex with his wife. And the narrator is like, I didn't know whether I should like destroy that and not like let that be known or public, or whether I should like give that to his wife and be like, here, this was his thing that he kept, like. And so this becomes the real central anxiety of the short story is, how do you, or how much control can you exert over what people will think of you after your death? And again, that's really, really important in a culture in which things like ancestor veneration and sort of prayers to ancestors and things like that are really, really important, right? You want to leave a positive impression for your descendants so that they will venerate you, because that is really, really important in traditional Chinese culture. So that's basically what the story is about. Now, there's some interesting stylistic elements to this, so I'm reading this out of the Norton Anthology of World Literature. Based on their introduction, their brief bio of Chu, it seems that she has gotten more experimental as a writer over time, and this is 1994. She started writing in the 60s. So it sounds like she's sort of expanded her style and become more unorthodox in her writing techniques. And of course, by 1994, something like stream of consciousness was not unorthodox, but there is this sort of stream of consciousness feel to this, as though, and I find this really fascinating because there's this bit here where the narrator is reflecting on his wallet. And he says, I didn't even have a credit card. Speaking of credit cards, and then he goes into this lengthy diatribe, like 4 paragraphs long, with one of the paragraphs being relatively bulky, about why people who pay in cash always seem so timid, whereas people who pay with a credit card always seem so self-confident. And he goes into this sort of long, almost psychoanalytic assessment in which he basically theorizes that people with credit cards have been assessed and trusted by the financial system to have a credit card. Now, I don't know what the situation is in Taiwan. In the United States, boy howdy, does that not follow. In the United States, it is relatively easy to get a credit card without being financially trustworthy. That may or may not be the same thing in Taiwan. I don't know. But it is this weird divergence. And while at the surface it seems completely untethered from what the story is actually about, it is still this meditation on living in the present versus living with a consciousness of the future. Because when you're paying cash, the transaction is over in the moment, right? But when you're paying with credit, you are saying, in the future, I will pay for this. I will cover this debt at some unspecified time in the future. And so in this story centrally concerned with the question of how one will be perceived after one's death, even this divergence into this seemingly weird random trivia is connected thematically to the central concern of the short story. Now, the other thing that I really want to talk about, because it is very important here, is the title of this short story, Man of La Mancha. As many people will know, Man of La Mancha is a reference to Cervantes' Don Quixote, the famous protagonist of Cervantes' satirical novel. Don Quixote is famous for, well, tilting at windmills. It has become the sort of axiomatic thing, but he's famous for attempting to do this thing that cannot be done, to resurrect the age of chivalry once the age of chivalry is past, to be a medieval-style knight after the medieval period, and to conquer enemies who are not real. So the choice, and the last one is probably the least relevant here, because death is, of course, real. This character has a near-death experience, but that title, which isn't really addressed in the story, that title is significant in terms of Chu's assessment of what this character is doing. This character, in attempting to curate how he will be viewed after death, is tilting at windmills. Like Don Quixote, who is attempting to do a thing that cannot be done, this character is attempting to do a thing that cannot be done. He is attempting to micromanage every aspect of his life, every component of his existence, in such a way that he can control how he is seen after death. And I think this is the sort of central thing that Chu is interested in, is you can't. That's not achievable. You have some control over this, but you cannot really achieve what this character wants to achieve. And again, this is where the whole "this is a nameless character" comes back into play, because the story itself, the structure and the construction of the story, prevent this character from really being remembered, right? We can remember the attributes of this character, but if you ask me the name of this character, for instance, which is a key component of our identities, names, of course, I can't tell you. In that sense, the character is not remembered. The objective of being memorable, of being remembered in specific ways and with his identity, because he again thinks a lot about how to establish his identity if he dies unexpectedly. The story itself prevents him from doing so.